hot. It's 5:01 and welcome into a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start off with a couple of stories that we were tracking late last week right here on the News Hour. First off, we'll turn our attention to Washington, D.C. and the federal government shutdown. President Joe Biden did sign some funding relief to keep the U.S. government operating until mid-March, avoiding a year-end shutdown and kicking future spending decisions into President Donald Trump's presidency. The legislation, which was dubbed the American Relief Act, did pass the Senate in a late-night 85-11 vote that wrapped up not long after the midnight shutdown deadline. This was late Friday night into early portions of Saturday morning. The House of Representatives passed the same bill in a earlier vote on Friday, 366-34. The passage of the legislation by both chambers caps off Congress's week of uncertainty as lawmakers sought to reorganize following the collapse of a previous funding agreement due to opposition from President-elect Donald Trump and other Republicans. As I mentioned in that vote count in the House, 366-34. Still some Republicans unhappy with the legislation that was brought forward by House Speaker Mike Johnson, working, in this case, across the aisle to get Democrat votes. Aside from putting government funding into next year, the 118-page bill does include $110 billion in emergency hurricane relief. That, of course, is going to help folks in western North Carolina dealing with the impacts of Hurricane Helene and folks in western Florida dealing with the impacts from Hurricane Milton. It also includes $30 billion in farm aid, extending the Farm Bill for one additional year, and it also includes a series of other minor provisions. The biggest thing not included in this legislation passed by Congress and signed by the president in a very short time frame as we ended last week, it did not have a debt ceiling suspension that Trump had been adamant about. That is something that he is going to have to deal with likely sometime come late spring, early summer of next year, and that will be a political battle that we will be tracking very closely right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Taking a look at some other news that we were tracking late last week, a federal judge has denied Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin's request for a temporary restraining order. This is in a dispute of more than 60,000 ballots in North Carolina's Supreme Court election. Griffin had sought the order to block the State Board of Elections from certifying Democrat Allison Riggs as the race's winner. According to U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers, in a motion that he wrote on Friday, or an opinion rather that he wrote on Friday, he says, a motion for temporary restraining order may only issue if the motivant moves a clear showing of immediate injury. The State Board of Elections indicated that no election certification will occur for this race until January 3rd of next year, or more likely January 6th. Griffin is the plaintiff and the election board is the defendant in the case. The statement from the counsel reads as follows. With notice of a defendant's position, the plaintiff's counsel responded in briefing that the defendants are poised to certify the election results in a matter of days. The statement of counsel in the briefing are not specific facts in an affidavit or a verified complaint, and the court finds that the plaintiff has failed to make a clear showing that he will suffer immediate injury before the defendant can be heard in opposition. Riggs, who is currently an appointed Democrat incumbent, does lead Republican Jefferson Griffin by 734 votes in the race that has not yet been certified. She filed paperwork Thursday to intervene in a federal case. Griffin filed a complaint Wednesday urging the state Supreme Court to block the election board from counting what he and other Republicans call, quote, unlawful ballots in the race. The election board responded the following morning by removing the case to Myers' federal courtroom. Justice Riggs won her 2024 general election contest against Republican Judge Jefferson Griffin. Riggs's lawyers wrote Thursday in their most up-to-date legal briefing. Now, 6 weeks more after than 5.5 million North Carolinians casted their votes and elected both Democrats and Republicans to statewide offices, Judge Griffin seeks to throw out 66,000 ballots, more than one of every 100 votes cast in North Carolina, in violation with North Carolina and federal law. Riggs's court filing continued by saying, as Judge Griffin says in his petition for writ of prohibition, he anticipates that if these ballots are excluded, then he will have won the contest. Necessarily, if Judge Griffin could win the election by virtue of his lawsuit, then this action has potential to overturn the outcome of the election in which Justice Riggs won. Her lawyers wrote, Justice Riggs has a vital interest in the outcome of this lawsuit, but was not named as a party to it. Intervention in federal cases will allow Riggs to, quote, protect her interests and have her election contest evaluated properly and in accordance with federal and North Carolina law, as well as in recognition of more than 2.7 million voters who elected her to stay on the North Carolina Supreme Court. Richard Myers is already overseeing a lawsuit that the North Carolina Democrat Party filed back on December the 6th, dealing with the same ballot challenges that Griffin addressed in his complaint. Griffin intervened as a defendant in this case. And bear with me and stick with me. There's obviously a lot of back and forth here. We've covered it all since Election Day as we provide this update this morning. Griffin did ask the North Carolina's highest court on Wednesday to issue an order blocking state election officials from counting those ballots from the November election. A board spokesperson responded to Griffin's latest complaint by pointing to a 43-page order that was issued back on December the 11th, responding to some of Griffin's challenge. He is continuing to seek a temporary stay before Monday to give the state Supreme Court time to consider his request of writ of prohibition. Griffin's lawyers did file a nearly 4,000-page document Wednesday afternoon detailing his request. In a part of his legal challenge, it reads as follows. Judge Griffin asks the court, that would be the state Supreme Court, to exercise its power as granted by the North Carolina Constitution to supervise inferior tribunals such as the State Board of Elections. Judge Griffin asks the court to issue a writ of prohibition that prohibits the state board from counting ballots cast in violation of North Carolina's statutes and Constitution. The state board has continued to issue rulings and administer our elections in violation of North Carolina law, and the board's lawlessness cannot be allowed to continue, wrote Griffin's lawyers. The state board is an administrative agency that has knowingly broken the law and refused to do anything about it, Griffin's lawyers argued. Indeed, the board has been breaking our election laws for decades. This lawlessness was brought to the board's attention back in 2023, well before the 2024 general election, but the board refused to correct its errors. His court filing says now those chickens have come home to roost. In the 2024 general election, the board's errors changed the outcome of the election for an open seat on this court. When those errors were raised again in valid election protest, the board then claimed that it was too late to fix its law-breaking. Griffin's court filing highlights three categories of election protests. The first, voters who registered without providing a driver's license number or the last four of their social security number. That relates to HAVA, the Help Americans Vote Act, which was passed by the federal government in the early 2000s. Number two of Griffin's complaints, voters who have never lived in North Carolina. And number three, overseas voters who did not provide photo identification. Going back to the legal challenges here, the court filing from Republican Jefferson Griffin, it says, in response to these protests, the state board and the opposition candidate, Justice Allison Riggs, have claimed that Judge Griffin is seeking a retroactive change in election laws that mischaracterizes the timeline. Our registration statuses require driver's license or social security numbers all the way back to 2004. Our state constitution has imposed a residency requirement since 1776, and photo identification has been required for absentee voting since at least 2018. The laws that should have governed the elections were therefore established long before this election. The state board simply chose to break the law. End quote. The State Board of Elections did have a meeting on Friday where they did look and kind of go through some of these unresolved protests from Griffin, as well as 3 Republican legislative candidates on some of these issues. We will take a look at some of those details coming up a little bit later on this morning. All to say, this case is now in the hands of a federal judge, Richard Myers. But we did learn from the State Board of Elections that they are not likely to be certifying this election until sometime either January the 3rd, that is next Friday, not the 27th, but the Friday after that, or potentially as early as January the 6th. That is 2 weeks from today. So obviously there are still a lot of moving pieces here. We are going to continue to follow those details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, and you can read the latest in this update from Judge Richard Myers. It is our top story this morning over at carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:11, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It is time to get a look at traffic this morning. We'll head on over to the traffic center and get an update from Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick, and great morning so far.
1110 99.3 WBT.
Hot. It's 5:18. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We are also streaming live on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel this morning, and you can now check out our podcast. It's available completely for free wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour in your favorite podcast app, and you can take the show with you on demand on your own time. Just tap that follow or subscribe button. You can also listen online by visiting WBT.com and hovering over the podcast tab. We got some breaking news in during the commercial break this morning out of the federal government. President Joe Biden is commuting the sentences of nearly all of the inmates on federal death row, a move that comes 2 weeks after he went through the single largest day of clemency in American history. This is from an announcement from the White House around 5:03 this morning. Of the 40 inmates on federal death row, according to deathpenaltyinfo.org, President Joe Biden is commuting 37 sentences to death, reclassifying their sentences to life without the possibility of parole. The 3 inmates that are not included are Robert Bowers, who is responsible for the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, which left 11 people dead outside of the Pittsburgh area. Dylan Roof, a white supremacist who killed 9 black parishioners at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. That was back in 2015. And one of the Tsarnaev brothers, who worked with the his other brother to perpetuate the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing that killed 3 people and injured hundreds more. The men being resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole are convicted of various murderous acts against one or multiple people. Among the victims of the 37 men are law enforcement officials, children, and other inmates. A handful of men on death row were also set to be executed with their co-defendants. Taking a look at the statement from the White House, again out at just after 5 o'clock this morning as we were coming on the air, it says, a statement from the president says, quote, "I've dedicated my career to reducing violent crime and ensuring a fair and effective justice system. Today, I am commuting the sentences of 37 of 40 individuals on a federal death row to life sentences without the possibility of parole. These individuals are consistent with the moratorium my administration has imposed on federal executions in the cases other than terrorism and hate-motivated mass murders. Make no mistake, I condemn these murderers. Grief for their victims of this despicable act and the aches for all of their families who have suffered unimaginable and irreparable loss. But guided by my conscience and my experience as a public defender, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, vice president, and now president, I am more convinced than ever we must stop the use of the death penalty at a federal level. In good conscience, I cannot stand back and let the new administration resume executions that I halted." This is a major story that we are tracking throughout the morning. It's just broke in the last segment. We'll keep an eye on any additional details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:22, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. U.S. Senator Ted Budd has a new position in Washington, D.C., and it could have some impacts on future elections. To go through those details this morning, Brianna Kramer from the Carolina Journal joins us this morning on the News Hour. Brianna, a big decision and a huge appointment for U.S. Senator Ted Budd, one of our 2 Republican senators in the state. What position is he stepping into?
Yes, good morning, Nick. They are already moving on from the 2024 election and preparing for midterms just around the corner. So U.S. Senator Ted Budd of North Carolina has been named one of the new vice chairs of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. And that is the campaign arm for the Republican senators. And they work to elect Republicans in the U.S. Senate on Capitol Hill. So North Carolina U.S. Senator Thom Tillis, the other senator here in North Carolina. He's up for re-election in 2026. And so this is a big deal here in North Carolina. There's 19 other Republican senators up for re-election in 2026 as well. And so Ted Budd is going to be one of a team of 5 senators who will serve in expanding, or at least they hope to grow, expand, and work to have a really good 2026 midterm election season.
Well, and midterm elections are always tough for the incumbent party. It doesn't matter if it's the Republicans or the Democrats in power. And specifically in this midterm, as you just noted, Republicans are going to have to defend 19 seats. That's a lot that they're going to have to deal with in those midterm elections. Brianna, I assume most people are familiar with the RNC, the Republican National Committee, but there's actually these election arms on both the Senate and the House side. Not only are they super influential, they raise a boatload of money. Some, in the case of the Republican committee that we're talking about, what, $260 million just in the last election cycle?
Yes. So for the Senate Republicans, their campaign arm raised $260 million. And then we have the National Republican Congressional Committee, and that is the House GOP campaign arm. They raised $228 million. So huge arms of the parties that are helping to reelect these members to Congress, or in some cases, elect new Republicans into office. And then we also look at the Democrat side, and they also have these arms that help to raise funds and transfer money out of these political committees and help their candidates as well. So the House Democrat arm raised $306 million. So that was actually the most in this past cycle. And then the Democrat Senatorial Political Committee raised $241 million. So obviously they're all really huge, really powerful, and they do a lot in the lead up to every election, every 2 or 4 years. They're planning far ahead and watching for what seats are going to be open and who they need to fundraise for, who has maybe an easy race, who is retiring possibly, and also the primaries, because that lies ahead as well.
Yeah, no question about that. And for Senate Republicans, I think most folks predicted it would be tough for them to get control of the Senate in this election cycle as we come off the high of the early November election. Not only did they hold a majority, Brianna, they're currently sitting at 53 seats, which may not sound like a lot compared to the 47 that the Democrats have. But in the U.S. Senate, that is a huge margin for Republicans to have. And most folks did not really think that was possible going into the election. They well exceeded any sort of expectations there.
Yes, that's right. With 53 Republicans in the Senate, they can really get stuff done if they want to. Now, there's definitely differences between the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans. And it looks like there's a little bit more controversy on the Senate side. And, they have John Thune is going to represent the entire Senate as the majority leader. And then he's made some appointments, Susan Collins and some other longtime Republicans who, they kind of tend to go for Democrat-leaning ideas sometimes and side with Democrats. And so that's why they're a little bit more controversial to some more hard conservative-leaning supporters. And so, there's a little bit more work that needs to be done on the Senate side in terms of, the bills to come in the months that lie ahead with the Trump administration taking the White House in January. But for the next 2 years, the Republicans will have control on Capitol Hill and the White House. So we'll see how much they can get done. But of course, they'll also be looking ahead for 2026 to, of course, try to keep that majority that they now have.
Well, obviously here in the state of North Carolina, Brown, it's pretty amazing when you look at the positions of power that Republicans from North Carolina are in. Of course, our story this morning about Ted Budd. We've got Chuck Edwards on the House side of this. Michael Whatley, the former head of the North Carolina GOP, is now the head of the RNC. His Trump's daughter-in-law from the Wilmington area is the co-chair of the RNC. It seems as if North Carolina, for all intents and purposes, is running many of these Republican outfits. I guess that goes to show the importance of this state, not only for the presidential election, but for these House and Senate seats that we see every 2, 4, or 6 years.
Yeah, that's right. We continue to see that North Carolina is a very important state. And we just saw that in this past election, how many times all of the candidates at the national level wanted to visit North Carolina continuously for weeks and months on end. North Carolina is a big player on the national stage. And we have, Representative Richard Hudson. He's the leader of the House campaign arm. And so we do have a lot of key players up in DC from North Carolina. And of course, we're a swing state. And so we really, have a lot of impact when it comes to these elections. And so we're going to have a lot going into 2026, I think. And we have some strong voices that will be at the front of the table leading the state and the elections to come.
You can read more on Brianna's story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. Where it's now 528, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to head on over to the traffic center this morning, get another look at the roadways on this Monday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Looking super on the interstate.
Hot.
It's 5:32. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Good Monday morning to you. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Merry Christmas. A couple days in front of the holiday. We are continuing to track some statewide news this morning. Amazing. Still tracking political news related to the election. We've got an update this morning out of the Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson's continued legal saga with CNN over a story that they ran back a couple months ago, about a month and a half or so before the election. The lieutenant governor this morning is accusing CNN of attributing, quote, vile and bizarre comments to him for sensationalization and spiteful purposes and to ruin his reputation during his recent campaign for governor. Robinson offered those comments in a federal court filing late in the day on Thursday in his defamation case against the television network. Robinson filed a response to CNN's motion to dismiss the case, which stems from an article that CNN published in September about Robinson's use of an adult website more than a decade ago. The lieutenant governor also seeks to have the case returned to North Carolina State Court. It's currently in federal court. U.S. District Judge Lewis Flanagan has set a January the 17th deadline for CNN to respond to Robinson's motion. The lawsuit targets both CNN and former porn store clerk Louis Money, who released a music video criticizing Robinson. In the most recent court filing from Robinson, it says CNN rushed to attribute vile and bizarre comments to Lieutenant Governor Robinson in its article, despite his denial and multiple indicators of unreliability in the data of which it relied on. It did so for sensationalization and spiteful purposes to ruin Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson's reputation with the gubernatorial election mere weeks away. Robinson would then, of course, go on to lose the November the 5th election to Democrat Josh Stein by over 800,000 votes. That works out to about a 15% margin. It's the worst gubernatorial loss in almost 40 years in the state of North Carolina. His legal mentions go on to say, Lieutenant Governor Robinson has alleged multiple facts and circumstances that would support a finding of CNN's reckless disregard for the truth, even under the clear and convincing evidence standard. At this stage of the motion to dismiss, this is more than sufficient to allow this case to proceed to discovery, where Lieutenant Governor Robinson will have the chance to further develop the record and to restore his good name. That's according to the court filing. CNN moved the case from state to federal court in November. The cable news network followed up with a motion asking Flanagan to dismiss the case. Louis Money also filed a motion to dismiss Robinson's claim. The filing reads, defendant CNN's notice of removal fails both procedural and substantive reasons, Robinson's lawyers wrote in a court filing supporting his motion to return the case to state court. Procedurally, CNN has failed to comply with the strict requirements of 28 U.S.C. 144.6 and well-settled Fourth Circuit case law by not representing unambiguous consent from the defendant Money for removal. Subsequently, it attempts to claim that Lieutenant Governor Robinson has no possible state law claim against defendant Money. CNN ignores the applicable standard for review and takes the unattainable position that a deliberate fabrication by Money is not enough to show actual malice. While it is common for news organizations like CNN to avoid liability for false statements of its sources under the actual malice standard, the source himself who fabricates something within his knowledge can seek no such refuge. Defendant Money did not request something to be heard. Repeat that. Defendant Money did not repeat something he heard. He made it up for himself, according to Robinson's lawyers. CNN has argued that Robinson should not have linked the network and Money in the same legal action. The network claims fraudulent joinership, meaning that Robinson tied two defendants together to keep the case out of federal court. Robinson's lawyers rebuked that, saying, put simply, there is no fraudulent joiner, there is no complete diversity, and this court must remain the case back to state court. Lawyers for Robinson and Money traded those accusations back in portions of early December. So this is something that is still very much ongoing and likely will continue to ongo. At least we've got until January 17th for CNN to respond to Robinson's motion. We will keep a close eye on that. You can read through many more quotes in this back and forth legal saga by visiting our website this morning, carolinajournal.com. You'll see one of our top stories there. Robinson rebutes CNN's arguments for dismissing defamation lawsuit. It's now 5:38 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. The holiday shopping season is upon us, not only across the United States, but here in North Carolina. To get some more details on that this morning, I'd like to welcome Andy Ellen, the president and general counsel for the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association, to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning to talk about what that holiday season and how that's shaking up here across the state. Andy, thanks for the time. You've got a first annual report out this morning. Can you tell us a little details about that?
Yes. So we contracted with the Appalachian State University Center for Economic Research and Policy Analysis to do a deep dive in North Carolina, both on the importance of the retail industry, but especially as we head into the holiday season, what we're looking at economically for this holiday season, and hopefully a very successful one.
Well, the last couple of years have been really rough on people's paychecks, wallets, pocketbooks, however you'd like to describe it, with inflation. But with that, it looks like we're starting to see a little bit of a recovery, a little bit of a comeback. You're expecting holiday shopping to actually be up this year. What do those figures look like?
We were looking for holiday shopping to be up in North Carolina. Last year it was about $42.08 billion. We're expecting about $42.24 billion this year, which is a great increase. Again, some of that, there are some inflationary factors in some of those figures, but overall very positive. And that's even with a very shortened holiday season. We only have 4 weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So this year it's a little shortened. It's going to be a little more, intense. So we're going to have to make up our sales in a very timely manner.
Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned inflation there, and as you go through the full report, which will be available at carolinajournal.com, you do have to, of course, calculate inflation into that. How does that whole process work as you work with the folks over at App State and got this study together?
They have some formulas that they put together with looking at inflation and sort of a baseline of what it would be without inflation and what it ends up being with inflation. And, and that's something that we're seeing across the board. But it also, has other factors, not just the price of the good, but also the price of labor, the price of transportation, the price of energy, those things that all get factored into why something on the shelf may be more expensive this year than it was last year or this month rather than last month.
Andy, the elephant in the room, of course, is the devastation and continued cleanup and recovery out in western North Carolina. Were you able to factor that into your report, and what is some of that looking like?
They did take that into account and trying to do it. And again, for the first time we've done this, having to put that big a factor into it is unusual, and we hope very unusual. I hope we don't have one of those again. There is just so much unknown in the western part of the state. There are parts of the state out there that are recovering and coming back faster than others. There are other parts of it around the Blue Ridge Parkway, or you think about a Chimney Rock or a Lake Lure area that are just completely devastated. But you are seeing some increased activity. I saw, the Biltmore Estate is back open, the Grove Park is back open, but those shops from Biltmore Village right beside of the Biltmore Inn, were completely destroyed. So that's going to play a big factor into not only the sales, but the employees who would be getting a paycheck, who would be turning around and spending that in the economy. The question is, if you were a tourism employee, did you stay or did you go south to Hilton Head or Charleston or somewhere else to get a job so you could support your family, and you're no longer here generating that money in the economy? So a lot of unknown there. We're hoping, that consumers will go out and support those businesses in the western part of the state where they're able to take tourists or they're able to take visitors, and support those businesses. They really need it.
Yeah, and I think for tourism, most people, of course, assume the eastern half of the state, the coast, is super busy during the summertime. But as we've unfortunately learned, a lot of folks unfortunately learning this over the last couple of weeks and months, that the western half of the state, it's all based around tree peeping and checking out the snow and enjoying some of those activities out there. So that's, of course, we're continuing to follow that recovery. As you mentioned, Andy, a little while ago, this is your first annual report. Tell us why you decided to conduct this study, and presumably this will be something that we'll see for years to come from the Retail Association.
Yes, sir. So my counterpart in Ohio has been doing this for a number of years, but oftentimes we get calls from media or other entities looking for what is the economic forecast for North Carolina, not only on the holiday season, but also on things like back to school. And the retail sector supplies one out of every 4 jobs in North Carolina, so probably the largest private employer. We felt it was imperative for us to have the data so we could look at it and then baseline it going forward through the years to see how retail is doing in North Carolina, especially around the holiday season. So that was sort of the impetus for us doing this, and we're, again, very excited about the first one and looking forward to many, many more of these.
Outside of this report, tell us a little bit of the day-to-day activities and what you guys are involved in throughout the year.
So we were founded in 1902, so coming up on our 125th anniversary. Our job is to make North Carolina the best place to operate a retail business. Our primary focus has always been advocacy, both at the state level and a lesser extent at the congressional and local level. But we work on things like sales tax and alcohol laws. Big focus of late has been organized retail crime and shopping, in this case during the holiday season, making sure people are shopping safe, buying things from legitimate sources. And then another big factor has been a program we have called Shop and See, which is post-COVID. We want to focus on getting consumers back into their physical store, pushing away from the laptop and going in and remembering why they enjoyed shopping locally so much. Those retailers are there every single day supporting their community, whether it's sponsoring the Little League team or the high school football team or the theater program. If you look just recently, our members are the largest donators to the food banks every year. Our organization does a $50,000 a year scholarship, or $50,000 a year donation to the North Carolina food banks. And we actually just did another $50,000 one to the western part of the state just this last week. So we're supporting the communities our members are. We hope others will come out and do that. That's what our organization is based around.
Great report. Thanks for the time. Andy Allen joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:44, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get another look at traffic on this Monday morning. We'll head on over to the traffic center with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. And
Hot.
Good morning again. It's 549 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Good Monday morning to you. Of course, a busy couple of weeks here with the holiday heading on. If you're out and about and traveling this morning, hopefully you're doing that safely and appreciate you spending some time with us. We are tracking a lot on the show this morning. Actually, some breaking news out of Washington, D.C. that we'll recap for you. President Joe Biden is commuting the sentences of nearly all of the inmates on federal death row, a move that comes 2 weeks after he went through the single largest day of clemency in American history. This is out from the White House in the 5 o'clock hour this morning. Of 40 inmates on a federal death row, according to deathpenaltyinfo.org, Joe Biden is commuting 37 sentences to death, reclassifying their sentences to life without the possibility of parole. The men being resentenced to life in prison without parole are convicted of various murderous acts against one or multiple people. Among the victims of the 37 men are law enforcement officers, children, as well as other inmates. Joe Biden saying in a statement earlier this morning, "I've dedicated my career to reducing violent crime and ensuring a fair and effective justice system. Today, I am commuting the sentences of 37 of 40 individuals on federal death row to life sentences without the possibility of parole. These communications are consistent with the moratorium my administration has imposed on federal executions in the cases other than terrorism and hate-motivated mass murder. Make no mistake, I condemn these murderers' grief for their victims of their despicable acts and the aches for all families who have suffered unimaginable and irreparable loss. But guided by my conscience and experience as a public defender, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, vice president, and now president, I am more convinced than ever that we must stop the use of the death penalty at a federal level. In good conscience, I cannot stand back and let the new administration resume the executions that I halted." Likely to get a lot of pushback and hear a lot about this throughout the day. You'll hear about it all day right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. In some statewide news that we are tracking this morning, the race for North Carolina Supreme Court, well, it is still not over yet as we sit here almost 2 months removed from Election Day 2024. A federal judge has denied Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin's request for a temporary restraining order in a dispute over more than 60,000 ballots cast in the North Carolina State Supreme Court election. Griffin had sought the order to block the State Board of Elections from certifying appointed Democrat Allison Riggs as the race's winner. U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers wrote in a motion on Friday, quote, a motion for temporary restraining may only issue if the movant moves a clear showing of immediate injury. The State Board of Elections indicated that, quote, no election certification will occur until January the 3rd, 2025, or more likely January 6th. According to Judge Myers, Griffin is the plaintiff and the election board is the defendant in this case. Reading from Myers, he says, with notice of the defendant's position, the plaintiff's counsel responded in briefing that the defendants are, quote, poised to certify the election results in the matter of days. The statement of counsel in the briefings are not specific facts in an affidavit or verified complaints, and the court finds that the plaintiff has failed to make a clear showing that he will suffer immediate injury before the defendants can be heard in opposition. The plaintiff, of course, here being Republican Judge Jefferson Griffin. Riggs, an appointed Democrat incumbent, does lead Griffin by some 734 votes in a race that has not yet been certified. She filed some paperwork on Thursday to intervene into the federal case. All of this wraps up, and all of this is around 3 categories of election protest from Griffin and his lawyers. The first is voters who registered without providing a driver's license number or the last 4 digits of a Social Security number. The second are voters who have never lived in North Carolina, and 3 are overseas voters who did not provide photo identification. So what does this mean? Well, his request to the North Carolina Supreme Court to issue that temporary restraining order, he asked that to be done before Monday, is not going to come to fruition. The State Board of Elections did have a meeting on Friday where they did look at and continue to look at some of the claims from not only Griffin, but 3 other Republicans in the General Assembly that made similar requests to the whether it was the State Board of Elections or courts in regards to some of these ballots. Because, however, the NCSBE did not really, they dealt with this a couple of weeks ago. Not a whole lot in regards to that at their Board of Elections meeting on Friday. They did vote 3-2 to dismiss those protests for Republican second-place finishers Griffin, Adams, Sossaman, and McGinn, finding that even if all outstanding protests went the GOP candidate's way, that the outcomes would not change. The chair of the State Board of Elections did make some comments about counting ballots, about people who died on Election Day. That was one of the claims that was brought forward by Griffin, and that is where things stand as of right now. Will there be any additional legal challenges? Likely so. We don't exactly know how all of that is going to play out. We'll continue to track it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour and over on our website, carolinajournal.com. I had the opportunity on Friday to be part of the PBS show State Lines, talking about some statewide issues and how they affect not only you here in North Carolina, but for the upcoming General Assembly session. And there was an interesting conversation. We talked about this last week with Representative Cecil Brockman, a Democrat from Guilford County, about him changing party affiliations. I was asked about that, and here was my response on PBS-NC.
Back to the previous point, I don't think he's having any major sort of ideological change in regards to this, but this comes down to something that the Democrat Party now, in the last 2 election cycles, in 2022, they said they had held off the supermajority from Republicans, only to have Tricia Cotham then change her party affiliation and gain it back. The likelihood that he does that, as we've talked about, is probably low. But he doesn't have to change his party affiliation to be at a doctor's appointment when a veto override is going on, or to just not be there in session when some of that stuff is happening. So if I'm the Democrat Party and the Democrat caucus here in the General Assembly, you've got to tread very, very carefully with this going forward.
And that is one of the major stories that we will watch heading into 2025. Of course, Democrats claim that they have held off the supermajority, yet their pressure campaign on individuals like Cecil Brockman continue to put the Democrat caucus in a state of disarray up in Raleigh, the North Carolina General Assembly. So we'll, of course, be tracking that as the long session kicks off heading into early parts of next year. That's going to do it for a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.